Yes. Hi, guys. This is wrong in so many ways, as I'm sure you realise. I'm prepared to bet that half of you are trying to read what it says on the screen. It's a bit like the app I'm afraid we're using. That too has not got the ideal font, and some of the choices of colour have been, shall we say, have mixed success. The point about this is it excludes a large number of people, both whether they can read it or not, or whether you feel you're included in the epithet guys. There are many ways to introduce myself, depending on my audience. One of the first is to say that I write in English using a Swedish QWERTY keyboard. For those listening, I'm a white middle-aged woman in a blue-grey top and with reasonably loud hair. I could say I'm a freelance translator working from Swedish to English, and I copy edit English, and I'm based in Sweden. I'm a translator who uses dictation and readback and have done for the last 15 years. And yes, I'm writing English, so I'm at an unfair advantage. And I was once a company secretary, so I write very fast on the computer. All these things are ways of introducing myself depending on the audience, and all are applicable here. I am a professional translator and an academic, not a linguist. I have to admit I was a historian rather than a linguist, so I specialise in academic work. Today, I am a happy member of several organisations, and at this particular meeting, I represent NEET, the Nordic Editors and Translators. They have an HQ in Finland and a very lively group which does exactly what it says on the tin. We are all based in a Nordic country and we are all either editors or translators. Not purely English, there are a range of languages. I'm very sorry, because I'm at this particular session, that I can't attend the parallel sessions on ethics and subtitling, but I'm very glad that I'm going to be able to watch them later, and I can warmly recommend it as a participant that you take every opportunity to follow the other presentations as well. Martina, can I just check, are you hearing me okay? Is the sound coming through? Because I've just had a message that my microphone's off. Good. What is inclusive language? I'm going to skitter through rather, because it's a very large and quite rightly controversial subject. My remarks are purely anecdotal. I'm not here to represent a significant study. I don't have a report to underpin what I'm going to be talking about. It's moving because there are so many variables. There are variables in our source languages. There are variables in our target languages. And of course, there are variables when it comes to our source languages in the sense of which source language are we using, which target language are we using. In my case, I use English. And as I'm showing on the map, there are plenty of versions of that. You have British, American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Indian, World English, and that's just before we get regional dialects and variations. So what I'm saying is I can't possibly speak for all English. When it comes to the Nordic countries, I can't possibly speak for all the Nordic languages either. You have to excuse my pronunciation on this, because there are Bokmål, Danish, Faroese, Finnish, Greenlandic, Icelandic, the Sami languages, of which there are 10 at least, and Swedish, and the unofficial national minority or regional languages, Danish Sign Language, Faroese Sign Language, Finnish Sign Language, German, Greenlandic Sign Language, Göteborg, Icelandic Sign Language, Jämtska, Karelian, Kven, Meänkieli, Mishatarta, Norwegian Sign Language, Nynorsk, Övdalsk, Romani, the Sami Sign Languages, which are in their infancy as yet, Swedish Sign Language, and Yiddish. Again, I've put up a map. It's not the most helpful one, but I think that might rather be the point. What's the Swedish for inclusive language? It doesn't have to say a lot. That's not the right way of putting it. It's not. It has. If we start with inclusive language at the European level, there are plenty of guides out there, such as this one, which comes from the European Institute for Gender Equality, which I can warmly recommend a visit. It's called the EIGE. The majority, fairly limited ambitions, of course, such as this example. There are narrow definitions operating on a word-by-word basis. So, for example, this one, whoopsie daisy. We have a slight technical hitch here. You're trying to close it again. Is it working? Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry, everybody. It must be deeply frustrating to have to see you are sharing your entire screen to everyone. Sorry, the majority of guides to inclusive language are, as I said, fairly limited. It does sound a little odd, but they do operate on a word-for-word basis. So they say that, the bottom line when you're working into English is don't say him/her, say they. Don't say she or he. Try and use neutral terms such as they or one. That's perfectly right, but as I said, somewhat limited in scope. Oopsie daisy, I'm afraid. There we go. When it comes to the Swedish for inclusive language as such, it doesn't really have a term of its own, which says a lot. There is the ever awkward inkluderande språk, which you can see here in examples for the Institute for Language and RFSL, two very useful organizations. The problem is that it's not very much, it's not a huge advantage to be neutral. In length, the Swedish version that's most often used, they talk of könsneutralt språk or gender neutral language. And that slightly falls down when it comes to the other forms of inclusivity one could hope for. It's also standard to say now, these days, that rather than speaking of gender neutral language, it's more helpful to speak of gender sensitive language. In a way, Swedish can't quite embrace that yet, but they do have språkmedvetenhet, or language awareness, which is very useful. This is from the Swedish Social Insurance Agency, large organisation, understandably, called Försäkringskassan. And as you can see immediately, the focus is naturally, because of what their remit is, gender. Although the neutral pronoun in Swedish, which was adopted in the recent decade, hen, is arguably not neutral at all. It could be said it reflects a third or multiple genders, a bit like the English they in its new uses. It's still very useful. This is the English translation done for the official websites. Even the Swedish Social Insurance Agency, or their heroic translators, occasionally trip over themselves. So they end up, instead of talking, if you can see at the bottom of your screen, they have the to-do list if you are pregnant, and the to-do list for the other parent, which of course causes all sorts of interesting issues for the person in question. The crucial thing, however, is that they've tried. Where are we coming from? English examples here for obvious reasons. I won't go too much with the Swedish or indeed any of the other Nordic languages. Stereotyping is what we want to avoid. So using gendered language when gender is irrelevant. Throw like a girl, man up, shut up. Belittling language, where men are the norm, women are inferior. I'll get the girls in the office to help. In this case, it would be the girls in the call centre to help. Or language where it omits people so that men, in this case, are the norm and women don't feature. All men are equal under the law, where no man has gone before. We forgive Star Trek, of course, actually, because they've given us with the Star Trek split to boldly go, and that's always very useful because, yes, it is possible to split infinitives if you're going for emphasis. Where are we meant to go with this? Which is a good question. There are no fixed answers. In both Swedish and English, we have the state of flux over people first or identity first language, for example, for neurodiversity. That would be the difference with people first language is when you say someone, they are people with autism. And if it's identity first language, you're going to say that it's autistic people. As translators, we're usually told the best thing to do is to ask people what their preference is. And it's quite correct that rather than, as Gian Maria Greco was talking about yesterday in the session yesterday evening, that we should avoid special versus normal, and accessibility demands that we recognize everyone has specific needs, yes. But on the other hand, as translators, we can't operate on a word-by-word basis, and we can't operate on almost very rarely can we operate on a person-by-person basis. So that means that for translators, as well as the individual words that we choose to use, what matters is the entire language. We don't want people to have access words here and there to feel included in some respects. We want them to access the entire language, the entire message that we're trying to communicate. It is more than just words. Although I'm not entirely convinced I'd agree with this. As I said, it's not Swedish. Language, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yes, possibly. Inclusive language can be when written language tackles unspoken assumptions as per the Social Insurance Agency. Inclusive language can also be when written language matches spoken language more accurately. And this is where the Swedish experience comes in. The act of writing down language shouldn't shut people out. It is a question of accessibility. Spelling reform is one way of rendering language inclusive and accessible. And that's why it's back on the Swedish table in Sweden. The last time that Sweden reformed its spelling formally and legislated for it was 1906. They have a long and proud history of sorting out spellings for reasons of inclusion, even though it's very rarely discussed as such. The example I've got here, you might be wondering why I've got a photograph of a school. It's Gothenburg's largest and oldest gymnasium, and it still has its pre-1906 spelling of its name with HV at the start, Hvitfeldtska. Those who remember the protests at the EU summit in Gothenburg in 2001 might remember that's the school where most of the protesters were staying. Spelling reform is a long way off in English. English is a large, prolix, and historically better at absorbing new languages and dialects that become new dialects in English or non-geographial dialects, very importantly these days. And perhaps it is easier for languages such as Swedish, which are generally, not to put a finer point in it, more pronounceable. And that brings us to the Swedish dom, dom, and dom, the third person plural, or personal pronouns, where the spelling DOM is coming up on the inside as the inclusive alternative. They are all three inclusive in the sense that their sense does not exclude. However, they are exclusive in how they're spelt. Many people in Sweden struggle with getting the right one. And no, not just new Swedes like me. In fact, ironically, my anecdotal experience is that new Swedes are actually far better at choosing the correct version to use, probably because we've been taught so well by the Swedish for Immigrant courses that most of us have attended. So when I say inclusion, I really do mean including everyone, not just a small subset of the population. And in Swedish, the use of these versions of the spellings, DE and DEM, used correctly or incorrectly, are used to exclude and to some extent denigrate. So language really is a burning issue in Sweden, although that might surprise many Swedes who would probably frame things instead in terms of immigration or law and order or the financial crisis. Yet inclusive language is a corollary of inclusion or lack of it. And that hangs together with spoken language and written language. Language reform in Sweden could make the majority language more inclusive. Okay, spelling reform, not language reform, but I think you get my idea. The squabbles offer a clue as to what the future might bring, especially for the more prolix languages. Sorry, just a moment. I've got a slight echo on the line.
Mi ricordo la password.
Okay. Just a moment. The current discussion, the squabbles in Sweden about spelling reform offer a clue as to what the future might bring for Sweden and indeed for the rest of us as we look around, especially for more prolix languages with more interesting spelling. Can it be legislated? The answer is yes. In Swedish, we'd say svar ja. Should it be legislated? Yes. I suspect it will be in the next decade in Sweden, although how, I'm not sure. It may be an edict passed down from on high, or it may be a parliamentary decision. Either way, we can be certain that it will be preceded by an official inquiry. Sweden is good at those. The problem is, it's not just one size fits all. It's not open to all languages to achieve an inclusive language as a whole, perhaps notably in our case, English. The best any of us can do is to be open for the changes as they come and perhaps get out and push for the changes we want, where they will serve a democratic purpose. I think the golden rule here is that the only thing to be intolerant of is intolerance. To translators as a group, I feel that it's very important that we shouldn't be put off. Everybody can win from using inclusive language and including our audiences in a different way, even translators. It doesn't make our job any more difficult. Although one lesson I have seen from Sweden is that we should be very careful of acting as gatekeepers and excluding people or holding people back or out. If we're going to be didactic about it, be gentle. This is an example from Robert Corddry's dictionary in 1604, which is the first mono-language English dictionary ever published, and an attempt to explain hard words unfamiliar to the public. Context matters. It's not a question of location, but context. It's not right for closed groups to use bad language. That's not the point, but we do have, as translators, to find our target audience, not just our target language. And in Sweden, for example, English is the key language for those who are in the early stages of learning Swedish or another official minority language. So the example I had earlier of pregnant parent has been found to cause some confusion for those who have Swedish or English as third, fourth, sometimes fifth languages. It doesn't mean the term is wrong, but sometimes it needs fine tuning depending on the context. And should we step in to improve things? There's accessibility demand that we deviate from the offensive original and make it a more inclusive target text. It's a moral issue and again depends on the context. It can be deeply divisive, it can be deeply defensive. Even when written in inclusive language, I have no answers on this. I've seen it in action around us in Scandinavia. Finally, I know when I see it. Inclusive language is a bit like pornography. You'll know it when you see it. I suspect from what I've seen in Sweden, you'll spot it when it's missing. Language should quite rightly reflect society and its priorities, and that means being inclusive both at the level of the words and the level of the language, which is where a lot of the Swedish organisations work so hard. But of course, we have to be wary of imposed or legislated cases where language is changed in a way that doesn't meet the democratic tests. You can't say anything anymore. That's the great shibboleth used to exclude and to avoid having to make sensible changes. Sweden doesn't have all the answers, if it has any at all, to be honest. It's very strong on gender. As I've mentioned, the Sami languages, it's not so strong at the moment. Now there are signs that Sweden Democrats, which is the Swedish far right, is wobbling on official minority language status. On the other hand, Sweden is a signatory to the European Charter for regional or minority languages. These are the people who've signed, the countries that have signed up. It's not going to happen because Sweden is a signatory, and there one can say that that is why the importance of legislating for language is crucial and a very important tool for accessibility. We all know, I hope, what we do matters as translators, whatever our language pair, or whatever we do, whether it's translation or interpreting. And I do think we can all achieve more if we share in the benefits of the inclusive language we all use in our work. Perhaps more important is to take along with us that it's our job as professionals to be alert and help things along. And that's where Sweden and the Swedish experience has shown. I'd say Scandinavia perhaps as a whole. So we need to go beyond translation to good, or perhaps even better to think that inclusivity and accessibility and kindness, as well as the good, the more communicated, more abundant grows. Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's time for question and answers. So if you would like to write your question directly in the chat or ask for the floor, you're free to do it.
Right, can you hear me? Very good. Sorry, I'm just trying to look through and see where have I got my questions. There we are. Well, I was thinking about Am I audible at this point? Have I managed to restore myself? Super, thank you, Martina. A question from Elizabeth Lundberg-Carlson. Why is hen not a suitable word? It's absolutely a suitable word. It's more that it's been said now that there is some confusion as to whether it is a neutral word in the sense that it has no particular overtones of gender whatsoever, or whether it's actually the term for third or multiple genders. So in other words, a strongly gendered word. There is some debate about this. I can't say that I'm qualified to speak definitively on the question. I find hen as the pronoun, H-E-N, very useful. But I suppose the best thing to say is that we will see how things develop over the next few years. I hope that's an answer. I was also going to say one, for example, from my own personal experience when it comes to inclusivity and exclusivity to do with language. And the normalization issue came from the symphony orchestra in which I play, in which we had, as usual, a list goes around for people to choose what they want in the way of food at the after party. And somebody most recently, they've now changed the system, so you have to choose between sandwiches and non-vegan sandwiches, which is, as I'd like to say, a very important point about normalization. It normalizes vegan. There we are. It's Halna Koshelup says that it needs to be more widely discussed. Yes, I think the answer is it helps many translators and language professionals if we have an open approach, although there is also the issue of what do we do in our efforts to be inclusive that then end up including intolerant language. And this is a thing that I have to work with quite hard myself, when occasionally one has source texts that are perhaps non-optimal. And the question of where do we go from there? Do we have any other questions at the moment? I think at that point, if we're coming up to the end, as it's 10, I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you for listening. It's been a real pleasure to speak about the question of accessibility and inclusion, a subject warm to my heart. And I do hope you enjoy the rest of the day and listening to the other parallel sessions when they're then made available later on. Thank you.
And if I can add a couple of points, please do not forget to go on slide